The carton of eggs shook faintly in her trembling hand, though not from weakness. It was rage, rage forced into silence. Elena Vargas stood in the crowded commissary checkout line, her old military jacket hanging off her shoulders like a ghost of a past life. The fabric was faded to a pale tan, the cuffs frayed, the stitching above her heart so worn it looked like nothing more than random threads. But those who knew, the very few who had ever glimpsed Falcon Unit's insignia, would recognize it. None of the young men behind her knew. "Hey, Cross," one of them whispered too loudly, his lieutenant's bars catching the fluorescent light. "Thinks she picked that jacket up at Goodwill? Maybe came with a half-empty whiskey bottle in the pocket." Laughter rippled through the line. Another officer, Walker, grinned and leaned forward just enough for everyone to hear. "Stolen valor's everywhere these days. You can spot it easy, outdated jacket, fake limp, scars they show off like trophies. Bet she's heading to the VA for a disability check." Several enlisted soldiers snorted. One woman in uniform smirked openly. A civilian clerk, scanning groceries 2 registers away, didn't bother to hide her chuckle. Elena kept her back straight, jaw tight and eyes forward. She shifted her weight onto her left leg to ease the fire in her right hip. She had survived worse than whispers. She had survived firestorms. Still the words cut. The cashier in front of her scanned her bread and soup cans with mechanical efficiency. He didn't greet her, didn't nod. When she slid forward her battered folder of documents, the young clerk at customer service shook her head immediately. "These papers aren't valid veteran verification, ma'am," the clerk said, with the brittle tone of someone reciting policy. "We need your DD 214, or your veteran ID card." "I've explained before," Elena rasped. Her voice was hoarse from disuse, each word weighted. "My unit was classified. My discharge records—" The clerk cut her off with a rehearsed smile. "Then I can't process this." Behind Elena, the lieutenants pounced. "You hear that?" Cross laughed. "Classified. That's what they all say. Lady, you can't even classify your laundry. Just admit you found that jacket in a dumpster." This time, laughter rolled through the crowd. The civilian woman with her phone out whispered, "I'm filming this. People need to see what kind of frauds try to scam the system." Elena's knuckles whitened on the edge of the counter, her vision tunneled not from shame, but from memory. Suddenly, the commissary dissolved into smoke, sand, and chaos. The stench of burning rotor blades filled her lungs. She was back in the desert 22 years ago. A helicopter went down in flames. Men shouted. Blood sprayed across dust. And her brother Miguel, Sergeant Miguel Vargas, was screaming at her to go, holding the perimeter with his M4 as shadows closed in. She saw him silhouetted against fire, refusing to fall back, his face set in the grim calm of someone who knew he wouldn't make it home. "Elena, go." The memory shattered like glass, slamming her back into the commissary. The laughter, the clerk's smirk, the phone camera still raised. Her groceries bagged, her documents pushed back at her, her dignity shredded. And then the automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss. The noise in the commissary dulled. A tall figure stepped inside, flanked by 2 aides, silver stars glinting on his shoulders. General Robert Kane, his presence filling the room with the weight of decades in command. He was speaking to an aide, papers in hand, until his eyes flicked up. For a fraction of a second, his gaze passed over her like anyone else's. And then he froze. His eyes narrowed on the faded ghost stitch above her heart. The papers in his hand slipped slightly. His chest rose once, sharply. Then with deliberate, unmistakable precision, General Kane stopped in his tracks and saluted. The commissary fell silent. The lieutenants behind Elena stopped mid-laugh, their faces draining of color. The crowd's confusion thickened as Kane's hand remained raised, rigid, unwavering. Elena stood still as stone, her bag cutting into her palm. Then, with the crisp muscle memory of a soldier who had once commanded life and death in shadows, she shifted her groceries to her left hand. Her right came up in flawless precision, returning the salute. The room held its breath. Kane's voice broke the silence, low and thunderous. "Captain Vargas, Falcon Unit, Operation Rook, 1999. Gasps shivered through the commissary. The words meant nothing to most but to a few old veterans in the room. The name struck like lightning. "Yes, sir," Elena said, her voice steady now. The world tilted. The humiliation inverted. The mocking laughter curdled into stunned silence. and the lieutenants who had mocked her only moments ago looked as if the ground might swallow them whole. The tide had turned. The morning had begun like every other, quiet, cold, and slow. Elena Vargas rose from her cot in the small, government-subsidized apartment near the base perimeter, her body stiff as wood. Her right leg locked up again, and it took both hands on the frame of the bed to force it straight. She sucked air between her teeth, waiting for the ache to ebb. The doctors called it degenerative trauma. She called it the price. On the dresser, her brother's photograph leaned against the mirror. Sergeant Miguel Vargas, grinning, 27 years old, in desert camo. That grin had followed her into every nightmare for 2 decades. Some mornings she whispered to him, other mornings she couldn't bear to. She pulled open the closet and reached, without thought, for the same jacket she had worn for years. Miguel's jacket. It still carried the faintest scent of burned sand, though she told herself it was just memory playing tricks. The falcon patch inside the lining, charred at the edges, rubbed against her palm as she slipped it on. It wasn't protection, it was armor. Outside, dawn broke over Fort Sheridan. The flag was raised with practiced precision. Recruits jogged in formation, chanting cadence that echoed off the barracks. To Elena, it sounded like ghosts calling through time. She walked stiffly across the grounds, straight-backed as always, her limp masked by sheer will. But eyes followed hair. Always. Whispers too. Who's the old lady? What's with the jacket? Homeless vet, probably. They thought she couldn't hear, but she heard everything. She had trained to hear whispers in the wind, the scrape of boots over gravel, the click of a rifle safety in darkness. Their voices were louder than they realized. By the time she pushed through the commissary doors, Elena had already steeled herself for the stairs. The smell of coffee and fried breakfast drifted across the aisles. Families filled carts, enlisted soldiers joked by the dairy case, retirees nursed free coffee near the front. To anyone else, it was a morning ritual. To her, it was a battlefield of gazes. She grabbed a basket and checked her folded paper list. Eggs, bread, soup, pasta, cheap, necessary. She traced a scar across her wrist as she compared prices, absently rubbing the raised skin. That's when Cross and Walker appeared. The 2 young lieutenants were everything Falcon Unit had once despised, arrogant, polished, eyes gleaming not from experience but from privilege. They wore new uniforms like costumes, not armor. Cross saw her first. His smirk spread like oil on water. Walker, he said, check the antique aisle. I think someone dragged a relic in. She ignored him, lifted soup cans, counted the difference between store brand and name brand. But they followed. Bet that jacket's older than Iraq. No, man, look at it. Vietnam vintage. She probably dug it out of a surplus dumpster. Maybe she'll sell it for booze money later. The jokes sharpened as they trailed her through the aisles. Their laughter bounced off the shelves until others joined in an enlisted specialist near the cereal aisle, a civilian clerk leaning on a cart, even a child repeating words he didn't understand but thought were funny. Every step Elena took, the weight on her chest grew heavier. Not from shame, from restraint. She reached for pasta on the top shelf, and her jacket sleeve slipped back, exposing the scar on her wrist. Walker's eyes lit up. Look at that, she's even got fake scars. Cross barked a laugh. Probably tripped on the curb outside. Her hand froze on the box of spaghetti. The memory surged again, her wrist cut on shrapnel as she dragged Miguel from a burning wreck. His blood hot on her skin, her scream drowned out by artillery fire. She placed the box in her basket calmly, as though the memory hadn't ripped open inside her. At the dairy case, her hip betrayed her. She stumbled slightly, reaching for eggs. Cross pounced. Classic Disability Act, he sneered. Bet she's heading to the VA next. File some claim about phantom injuries from classified missions. Laughter again. Louder this time. Crueler. People looked, nodded, chuckled. The room felt smaller, suffocating. But Elena did not answer. She had learned long ago the deadliest response was silence. At the checkout, the cashier's glance flickered over her jacket, lingered on the ghost patch stitching, then looked away quickly. No greeting, just the beep of groceries. When she presented her papers, the young clerk at customer service smiled politely but coldly. I'm sorry, ma'am, this doesn't prove veteran status. I'll need your DD 214. I've explained, Elena said evenly. Falcon unit, no DD 214. I have a letter from DOD. The clerk shook her head. We need standard documentation. The lieutenants behind her were practically salivating now. Cross raised his voice for the crowd. Falcon unit? Never heard of it. Ma'am, did you invent your own army? Snickers erupted. Someone muttered fake vet. Another said, beggar. And then came the final blow. A civilian woman raised her phone, recording. Look at this fraud, she hissed, trying to scam benefits. The words sliced deeper than she wanted to admit. She had fought in shadows so others could live in the light, and now, in the light, she was branded a liar. Her grip on the folder tightened until her knuckles ached. She thought of Miguel again, his voice echoing from the firestorm. Go, Elena, go. The folder slid back toward her, rejected. The clerk smiled with rehearsed sympathy. Sorry, nothing I can do. The laughter swelled, and then silence. The doors opened. General Robert Kane walked in. The atmosphere shifted instantly, like a storm cloud tearing across a blue sky. He scanned the commissary, his eyes passing over her once, then stopping, locking onto her. The world braced itself. The clerk's smile was thin, rehearsed. Ma'am, without proper verification, I can't enter you into the system. It's policy. Elena slid her documents forward again, her voice even though her chest burned. These are direct from the Department of Defense. That's all they'll allow me to carry. The young woman shifted uneasily, but her tone remained firm. I understand, but I can't accept them. You'll need to contact the VA. Elena exhaled slowly. She'd done this dance before, 3 months ago, 6 months ago. Every time the same answer. The records were sealed so deep, they might as well not exist. It was a circle designed to grind her down. Behind her, Cross pounced on the silence. See? Told you? His voice carried, oily with triumph. Stolen valor case, plain as day. Can't prove a thing, Walker chimed in. And what's the scam this time, huh? Food discount? Disability check? Maybe both? A ripple of chuckles spread through the line. Soldiers nudged one another. A civilian mother whispered to her son, Don't stare, honey. But her eyes lingered with disapproval, the way one might look at a pickpocket. The specialist from earlier raised his voice. People like that should be fined, taking benefits away from real vets. Someone else added, or locked up. The laughter grew sharper, cutting closer. Elena stood motionless, her jaw set, her grocery bag heavy at her side. She thought of Miguel again, crouched in the desert dust, pressing a bloody hand to her shoulder and shouting over the roar of gunfire. Don't stop. Don't ever stop. But here she was, stopped cold by bureaucracy, by children in crisp uniforms who had never known sand in their teeth, never known what it meant to watch a brother burn so others could live. The civilian with the phone raised her voice. Everyone, look here. This woman says she's a veteran, but the base clerk just proved she's not. Fraud caught red-handed. She tilted her phone toward Elena, live streaming humiliation for strangers to gawk at. Cross's grin widened. He gave an exaggerated salute in her direction. Thank you for your service, ma'am. Or should I say, for your performance. The words stung not because they were true, but because they weaponized everything she had once lived for. Service, sacrifice, brotherhood. The clerk slid the documents back toward her. I'm sorry, she repeated, as if that phrase was a shield. Next, please. The words struck like a gavel. Dismissal. For a moment, Elena didn't move. The room seemed to tilt sideways. The sound of laughter blended with the phantom whir of helicopter blades. She smelled the heat of burning fuel, heard the crack of rifles, felt Miguel's blood soaking into her sleeve. Her hand trembled not from fear, but from fury she had chained for decades. The lieutenants pressed closer now, like hyenas sensing weakness. Hey, lady, Walker sneered. Where's your platoon? Oh, right. Doesn't exist. Cross leaned in with a whisper loud enough for half the commissary to hear. Maybe it's time to retire the act before someone files a report. The crowd laughed again. A cruel chorus. And then silence, sharp as a blade. The automatic doors slid open with a hiss. General Robert Kane stepped through, flanked by 2 aides. The 4 stars on his chest gleamed, the weight of his presence bending the air. Conversations died mid-sentence. Soldiers stiffened instinctively, spines straightening at the sight of him. Elena shifted to the side, lowering her gaze, her instinctive habit when ranking officers passed by. She hugged her bag tighter, willing herself invisible. But Kane's eyes swept the room, casual, detached until they locked on her. For an instant, his face was unreadable. Then his body went rigid. The papers in his hands sagged, forgotten. He stared at her jacket, at the faint outline of threads above her heart, the ghost of a patch, erased by time and secrecy. Recognition struck him like thunder. He stopped walking, and with crisp, flawless precision, General Robert Kane snapped into a salute. The commissary froze. Forks paused midair. Conversations collapsed. Even the hum of refrigerators seemed to vanish. Cross and Walker's smirks curdled into confusion. Then horror. The crowd stared, eyes flicking from the general's rigid arm to the woman they had just mocked. Elena's breath caught. She hadn't seen a salute in her direction for over 20 years. Her body moved before thought. She shifted her groceries, raised her right hand, and returned the salute with soldier's perfection. Her movements cut through the air like a blade. Kane's voice broke the silence, steady and resonant. Captain Elena Vargas. Falcon Unit. Operation Rook. 1999. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The lieutenants went pale. The clerk dropped her gaze. The civilian lowered her phone, her live stream still running. And Elena Vargas, who minutes before had stood in the ashes of humiliation, straightened her back, locked eyes with the general, and answered in a voice that carried like steel across the commissary. Yes, sir. The balance of the room shifted. The tide turned. The ghosts of Falcon Unit stood taller in that moment, their silence broken by a salute that told the world they had lived, they had fought, and they had not been forgotten. For a long, suspended moment, the commissary was as silent as a battlefield just before the first shot. General Robert Kane lowered his salute only after Elena had returned hers, his movements deliberate, formal, carved from a lifetime of discipline. His eyes never left her. Captain Vargas, he repeated, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. Falcon Unit, Operation Rook, 1999. Whispers erupted. Names and phrases darted from mouth to mouth. Falcon Unit, Operation Rook. But most shook their heads. They had never heard of such things. And that was the point. Cross swallowed audibly. Walker's face drained of color. The crowd that had mocked now stared, wide-eyed, as realization dawned. General Kane stepped closer, ignoring the clerk, ignoring the murmurs, ignoring the cell phone still recording. He looked at Elena as if seeing through time itself. 3 helicopters went down that night, Kane said, his tone somber. Dozens of us were pinned in the canyon. They told us there was no way out, no chance. He drew a breath, his gaze steady. But Falcon Unit carved the corridor. Without them, without you, 32 men and women, including myself, would have been left to die. The commissary air thinned. Soldiers who had been chuckling now stood stiff, ashamed. Veterans at the coffee stations straightened, eyes glinting with recognition of the tone, if not the mission. Kane's next words fell like hammers. Officially, that mission never happened. Records were buried, but I remember. And I will not stand silent when the last surviving officer of Falcon Unit is disrespected in my presence. Gasps rippled again. The lieutenants looked as though they had been struck across the face. Elena said nothing. She didn't need to. The weight of Kane's voice had done what she had refused to do. Expose the truth without breaking her vow of silence. Kane turned his head slowly, his gaze locking on Cross and Walker. You two, he said, his tone sharp enough to cut steel. The lieutenants snapped to attention instinctively, their training colliding with raw terror. Names, Kane demanded. Lieutenant Jason Cross, sir. Cross barked, his voice cracking. Lieutenant Mark Walker, sir. Kane studied them with a stare that stripped away every layer of bravado. You mock what you do not understand. You ridicule sacrifice you could never fathom. And you dare do it within the same walls where heroes walk quietly, unseen. Neither lieutenant dared breathe. The crowd pressed closer, the weight of the moment thickening like storm clouds. Kane's voice deepened. You will apologize. Here. Now. Loud enough for every soul in this commissary, to hear. Cross's Adam's apple bobbed. He stammered, then forced the words out, stiff as rusted hinges. Captain Vargas, I apologize. My words were unworthy of this uniform. Walker followed, his voice hoarse. Ma'am, I apologize. I spoke without respect, without honor. The words hung in the air, trembling. Kane did not blink. Louder! The lieutenants snapped their spines straighter. This time, their voices boomed. Apologies, Captain Vargas. We were wrong. We disrespected you, and it will not happen again. The commissary was dead silent. Elena's eyes moved over them, cold, steady. For the first time, she spoke directly to them. Her voice was low, but it carried like a blade through fog. You couldn't have known, she said. That was the point of Falcon Unit. We fought in shadows so you could live in light. But arrogance is a luxury soldiers cannot afford. Learn that lesson now, or men will die when you command them. Cross and Walker's faces burned crimson. Neither dared answer. General Kane nodded once, satisfied. Return to your duties. They saluted, voices trembling. Yes, sir. Then they retreated like beaten dogs, their humiliation complete. The crowd shifted uneasily, many ashamed of their laughter minutes before. A few veterans by the coffee station offered Elena subtle nods of respect. Even the clerk behind the counter looked as though she wished to vanish into the linoleum. Kane turned back to Elena, his voice softer now. Captain, would you join me for coffee? For the first time in decades, Elena felt the weight of recognition, pressing not against her, but lifting her. She gave a single nod. Of course, sir. The commissary parted as they walked toward the small cafe corner, the silence thick with awe. Soldiers, clerks, even civilians stepped back, eyes tracking every movement of the woman they had mocked. Elena's limp was still there. Her scars were still there. The jacket was still faded and frayed. But suddenly, none of that mattered. Because the truth had stepped out of the shadows. The commissary cafe was a humble corner, plastic chairs, formica tables, a counter serving coffee that tasted of scorched earth. Yet when General Robert Kane sat there with Elena Vargas, it might as well have been a tribunal chamber. Every eye remained locked on them, though no one dared approach. Kane ordered black coffee with the clipped authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Elena, almost automatically, requested the same. She set her grocery bag on the floor, her hand resting lightly on it, as though it were an anchor holding her steady. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was not awkward but heavy, like the air before a storm breaks. Finally, Kane leaned forward, his steel-gray eyes piercing hers. I never thought I'd see you again, Captain Vargas. Her mouth tightened. I thought the same, sir. After the debrief, Falcon Unit disappeared from every record I could find. Kane nodded, jaw tense. That was deliberate. Triple-blind protocols. Your names were burned from files even I couldn't access afterward. But I never forgot. Elena's gaze drifted, her mind flicking back to desert nights filled with dust storms and radio silence. We were told to vanish, she said, to walk away as if none of it had ever happened. Except, her voice faltered, her throat tightening. Except, some of us couldn't walk away at all. Kane's eyes sharpened. How many made it home? Her hands clenched. She forced the words out. 3 out of 8, she swallowed hard. Now I'm the last. Kane's face hardened, though his voice was gentler. Your brother, Elena's breath caught. She had not spoken Miguel's name aloud in years, as if keeping it buried would protect her from the wound reopening. But here, with Kane's eyes on her, the truth forced its way out. Miguel Vargas, she whispered. Sergeant, communications, my brother. Her lips trembled, but her eyes blazed. They said he died in a training accident. That's what they told his wife. That's what they told his daughter. But I watched him hold the canyon alone while we evacuated. I watched him burn, buying us the time to escape. The words cracked open something raw in her chest. The airmen delivered their coffees, trembling as he set them down. Neither Kane nor Elena touched them. Kane's voice dropped, carrying the weight of confession. I knew. I recognized him, even through the smoke. Vargas covered the last ridge so we could get the choppers out. His stand saved my life. Saved all of ours. And then the reports came back, doctored. A malfunction, a training mishap. His hand curled into a fist. I wanted to fight it then, but the classification was ironclad. I wasn't allowed to even say his name. Elena blinked hard, but a single tear slipped free, trailing down her scarred cheek. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, her voice brittle but strong. I've carried him every day since. His jacket, his patch, his silence. She glanced down at the worn threads above her heart. This is all that's left of him in the world. Kane studied her, his own eyes shadowed with grief and fury. Not anymore. She met his gaze, almost wary. What do you mean? He straightened, shoulders rigid with command. I still have authority, more than most, and I'll use it. The system may move slowly, but today it begins. Falcon Unit's record will no longer be buried in dust. Your brother will no longer be listed as a training casualty. And you, Captain Vargas, will not fight alone anymore. The words struck like thunder, reverberating through her. For years she had endured silence, rejection, humiliation. For years she had carried Miguel's death like a secret curse. And now, sitting across from a four-star general who had survived because of them, the promise of recognition felt like oxygen in lungs starved too long. But even as her heart swelled, she shook her head slightly. Sir, bureaucracy isn't a battlefield you can win with rank alone. They'll bury it again. Kane's jaw flexed. Not while I breathe. Silence wrapped around them again. But this time it wasn't heavy with despair. It was heavy with resolve. Across the commissary, the crowd watched in hushed awe. Soldiers who had sneered now avoided her eyes. Civilians who had mocked clutched their carts in awkward silence. Even the lieutenants stood frozen near the exit, their shame written plain. Kane leaned in, his voice low enough for only her to hear. What kept you fighting, Elena? All these years, beaten down by red tape and scorn? Her fingers brushed the inside lining of the jacket, feeling the charred patch there. She closed her eyes briefly, and Miguel's voice rose again from memory. Don't stop! Don't ever stop! When she opened her eyes, they gleamed with quiet fire. Because I promised him I wouldn't. Kane nodded once, firmly, as though sealing a pact. Then let me promise you this. His sacrifice and yours will be remembered. The commissary, moments ago a theater of mockery, had become a cathedral of silence. And in that silence, Elena Vargas felt for the first time in 22 years that her brother's ghost was no longer screaming alone in the desert. General Robert Kane reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a sleek black phone, the kind issued only to those with clearance beyond the ordinary. His expression was carved from stone, his movements precise. Elena's eyes widened slightly. Sir, what are you doing? Ending this farce, Kane said flatly. He scrolled quickly, then pressed a contact. His voice, when it came, was not the conversational tone of moments earlier. It was the sharp, commanding bark of a four-star general. This is General Kane. I need immediate contact with the Department of Defense Records Command. Priority level Omega clearance. He paused, listening. Yes, I'll hold. The commissary, though buzzing at the edges with whispers, seemed frozen around him. Elena sat still, her hands curled around her untouched coffee, watching a man wield authority like a weapon. When the line picked up, his tone hardened further. Authorization code. Delta 9, Bravo, 407, confirm. He paused again, then nodded once. Good. Listen carefully. I want every file related to Falcon Unit, Operation Rook, 1999, declassified for personnel recognition purposes. Immediate release restricted to medical and service validation. This is not a request. It's a directive. The silence stretched. Kane's jaw flexed as he listened to the inevitable objections. Yes, I know those files are sealed under triple-blind protocol. Yes, I am aware of the consequences. Override them. This is a direct order under my authority. His voice rose, sharp as gunfire. You will prioritize this today. Not next week. Not next month. Today. Hi. Kame. Ini 70 on. Rai says. Elena sat frozen. She had spent years being told nothing could be done. That her brother's death, her injuries, her very service existed only in whispers and shadows. And here was Kane, cutting through layers of secrecy with a phone call, as though he were ordering artillery fire. Finally, Kane's voice softened slightly. I expect confirmation on my desk by 1700 hours. If I don't have it, I'll make calls to Congress myself. Do not test me on this. He ended the call with a snap and slipped the phone back into his pocket. The commissary remained hushed, all ears straining to absorb what they had just witnessed. Kane looked back at Elena, his expression gentler now, though his eyes still burned. It's begun. Her throat felt tight. Sir, you can't possibly. I can, he cut her off. And I will. Bureaucracy is a fortress, Captain, but I still know where the gates are. They'll move slower than I like, but they'll move. For the first time in decades, hope flickered in Elena's chest. Fragile. Dangerous. She tried to push it down. Even if they declassify enough for records, it won't bring Miguel back. Kane's gaze softened. No, but it will give his daughter the truth, and it will give you the recognition you should have had years ago. You deserve your benefits, Captain Vargas. You deserve peace. Peace. The words sounded foreign. She almost laughed, but the sound caught in her chest. As if summoned by fate, the lieutenants reappeared at the edge of the cafe. Cross and Walker approached with rigid posture. Faces pale, eyes locked forward. Their earlier arrogance had burned away, leaving only shame. Sir, Cross said, snapping a salute, request permission to speak. Kane raised an eyebrow, then glanced at Elena. She gave a small nod. Granted, Kane said. Cross turned toward her, his voice stiff but sincere. Captain Vargas, I apologize for my behavior. For the words I spoke. They were disgraceful, unworthy of an officer. I mocked what I didn't understand. Walker's voice followed, rough with guilt. I joined him, ma'am. I mocked you too. We failed in respect, in duty, in honor. We disgraced the uniform. The cafe was silent. Soldiers leaned forward, listening. Civilians shifted uneasily. Elena studied them both, her eyes sharp but calm. You judged by appearances. You thought the measure of a soldier was a patch on a sleeve, a shine on boots, or the smoothness of skin. But the measure of a soldier is sacrifice. Both lieutenants flinched. She leaned closer, her voice low but cutting. And you are lucky, because today, your arrogance cost you only your pride. Someday, if you carry it into battle, it will cost lives. The words landed like strikes. Cross swallowed. Walker nodded once, his shame etched in every line of his face. Kane's voice cut in, commanding once more. Let this moment sear into you. Remember it every time you see a veteran, every time you think you know more than the person beside you. Do not forget what arrogance costs. Yes, sir, they barked in unison. Kane dismissed them with a flick of his hand, and they retreated quickly, almost stumbling in their haste. Elena let out a slow breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The ghosts were still there, but for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was carrying them alone. Kane sipped his coffee finally, grimacing at the bitterness. Still terrible, he muttered. Then he looked back at her. But I'll be damned if this wasn't the most important cup of coffee I've had in years. Elena managed a faint smile, small but real. The first in a very long time. 3 weeks later, the morning sunlight slanted across Fort Sheridan, just as it always had. Recruits marched in cadence, flags snapped in the wind, and vehicles hummed to life. To the casual eye, nothing had changed. But for Elena Vargas, everything had. The limp was still there, yes, but less severe. Hours of physical therapy sessions she had begged for over years of rejected claims had finally begun. She could feel strength returning to her shoulder, the knot of pain loosening just slightly with each stretch. Even her right hip, though stubborn, had begun to yield under careful treatment. Her apartment, once bare and cold, now felt a little more alive. Prescription bottles sat neatly on her table, paid for without her having to choose between them and groceries. A letter from the VA stamped approved lay folded beside Miguel's photo. She had stared at that word so long she could still see it when she closed her eyes. When she pulled on the jacket that morning, something had shifted. The threads above her heart were no longer ghost stitches. Kane had sent the restored Falcon unit insignia himself, carefully embroidered, the edges still muted but unmistakable. For the first time in 2 decades, she wore it openly. Not as a secret, but as a statement. The commissary doors hissed open as she stepped inside. This time, the crowd noticed her immediately, but the eyes that met her didn't sneer. They nodded. Some saluted. A veteran at the coffee station raised his mug in silent recognition. A young corporal stepped aside to clear her path without being asked. It was subtle, but undeniable. The room had changed. She gathered her basket, her list folded neatly in her pocket, and moved down the aisles. For once, there was no laughter trailing behind her, only the faint hum of respect. Halfway down the canned goods aisle, she saw him, Lieutenant Jason Cross. He stood alone, a shopping cart half filled with supplies. His uniform was neat, but there was none of the swagger he once carried. He looked up and saw her, and his face shifted recognition, then embarrassment, then something heavier. For a moment, he froze. Then, with stiff precision, he left his cart and walked directly toward her. He stopped 2 paces away and snapped to attention, his voice steady but low. "Captain Vargas," he said. "Ma'am, I owe you more than one apology." Elena regarded him coolly, the box of beans still in her hand. "You gave one already?" "Yes, ma'am," he said quickly. "But words are cheap. Since that day, I've been reassigned to ethics development sessions. General Kane himself introduced your case as part of our training." His eyes flickered down, then back up. "They call it the Vargas lesson, about humility, about judging by appearances, about respect owed, even when you don't understand." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "They're teaching my humiliation as a lesson?" "Not humiliation," Cross said quickly, his voice firm. "Your dignity, your restraint, and my failure. They make us read reports, testimonies, and what little has been unsealed. Every new officer hears your name now. They learn what I refused to see that day, that heroes don't always wear clean uniforms or walk without limps. Sometimes they carry ghosts." Elena studied him. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something she hadn't expected. Resolve. "You've learned something then," she said softly. "Yes, ma'am." His voice cracked slightly. "I thought honor was about polish, about posture, but it's about sacrifice. I judged you by the jacket. I should have judged myself by the oath." Silence stretched between them. Elena finally placed the beans in her basket and straightened. "We all learn, Lieutenant. Sometimes the most valuable lessons come wrapped in shame." Cross nodded once, sharply. "Thank you, ma'am, for the lesson and for your service." He snapped a salute, crisp, sharp, and sincere, before returning to his cart. Elena stood for a moment longer, her fingers brushing the falcon patch on her jacket. For years she had worn it as a private memory. Now, it was a living reminder not of her shame, but of her brother's sacrifice and her own endurance. She moved on, but a thought tugged at her. Kane had said this was just the beginning. If even one arrogant lieutenant had been changed by her story, what else could come? For the first time in decades, the ghost she carried felt lighter. The commissary doors opened with their usual metallic sigh, but this time, Elena Vargas walked through them, not as a shadow, not as a whispered rumor, but as a name known across Fort Sheridan. It had been 3 months since that morning when General Kane's salute shattered her invisibility. 3 months since the lieutenant's jeers turned to shame, since the buried files of Falcon Unit began to crack open under the weight of Kane's authority. Now, the jacket she wore was no longer a ghost of memory. It had been carefully cleaned and preserved, the frayed edges mended, the fabric pressed. Above her heart gleamed, the restored Falcon Unit insignia subdued, but unmistakable. Below it sat a new addition, the small, gleaming pin of a presidential unit citation, finally awarded after 2 decades of silence. The first time she pinned it on, her hands had trembled. She had stared at Miguel's photo, whispering, "This is for you, brother." Inside, the commissary buzzed with its usual life. Families with carts, recruits buying protein bars, retirees gathered around the coffee urn. But the way they looked at her was different. Heads turned, soldiers straightened. Civilians shifted with uneasy respect. No one laughed anymore. Instead, nods met her gaze. Quiet greetings, a few subtle salutes. A retired sergeant at the counter raised his cup of coffee and said, "Morning, Captain." "Morning," she replied softly, the words no longer sticking in her throat. Her limp was still there. though less pronounced now. Physical therapy had begun to rebuild her strength. Her hip no longer screamed with every step, and her shoulder, though stiff, had regained some range. She still carried pain she always would, but for once it felt like progress instead of punishment. She picked up her basket and moved through the aisles with practiced efficiency. The list in her pocket was shorter these days. For the first time in years, she didn't have to count every penny or choose between medicine and meals. Disability benefits had been restored. The VA's tone had shifted from suspicion to deference. She even received letters, official letters that began with the words, "Thank you for your service." At the dairy case, she noticed a familiar figure, Lieutenant Walker. Unlike before, he didn't smirk. He didn't whisper. He straightened immediately, his face flushing, and gave her a crisp salute. She returned it with measured calm. "Captain Vargas," he said quickly, almost stumbling over the words, "I wanted to let you know that I've been reassigned. Ethics oversight," General Kane insisted. He swallowed. "They use your case to train us now. Every lieutenant hears it. What happened in this commissary, it's part of our curriculum." Elena arched an eyebrow. "Is that so?" "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice tight but earnest. "They call it the Vargas Protocol. Respect without assumption, no judgment without proof, and never mocking the scars you don't understand." His words carried shame, but also determination. She let him stand there a moment, sweating under her gaze. Then she nodded once. "Good lessons. Make sure they stick." "Yes, ma'am," he said, saluting again before retreating. She turned back to her basket, but her mind lingered. The Vargas Protocol. Her humiliation had been repurposed into education, her silence into a doctrine. As she moved toward the checkout, she passed the coffee station. A group of veterans looked up, their eyes narrowing, then softening. One of them, an old master sergeant with a voice like gravel, spoke quietly. "Knew it," he said. "Always figured that jacket meant something, just couldn't ask." Elena paused, meeting his gaze. "Thank you." He tipped his cap. "About damn time they recognized you." She paid for her groceries, the cashier now greeting her by name, Captain Vargas, and handing her receipt with a smile that carried no mockery, only respect. As she walked toward the exit, she caught her reflection in the glass doors. For the first time in decades, the woman staring back stood taller, her insignia gleaming, her limp no longer defining her. The commissary was the same, the aisles were the same, the shelves were the same, but she was not, because she was no longer invisible. Elena had just set her groceries on the counter, preparing to pay, when a hesitant voice broke the air behind her. "Excuse me, Captain Vargas?" She turned. Standing a few feet away was a young officer, no more than 25, her posture ramrod straight, her uniform immaculate. Lieutenant's bars gleamed on her collar. She looked nervous but determined, like someone approaching a figure they had only read about. "Yes?" Elena said cautiously. The young woman snapped into a crisp salute. "Lieutenant Sarah Ochoa, ma'am, 103rd Military Intelligence Battalion." Elena returned the salute automatically, though her expression remained guarded. "At ease, Lieutenant. What can I do for you?" Ochoa's dark eyes shone with admiration, tempered by respect. "Ma'am, I've been studying Falcon Unit. What's been declassified, I mean. Your techniques in extraction and survival, they've already been integrated into the new field manual." She drew a breath, steadying herself. "I just wanted to thank you, and to ask if you would consider speaking to my platoon." Elena blinked. For a moment, she thought she'd misheard. "Your platoon?" "Yes, ma'am," Ochoa said quickly, her words tumbling with nervous energy. "They'd benefit tremendously from hearing directly from you, from someone who lived what we only study in theory. We read the lines, but we don't feel the weight. You could give them that." Elena stared at her, stunned. For 20 years, she had been erased, forced into silence, branded a fraud. And now, a young lieutenant, a woman who could have been her daughter, was asking to learn from her. Her instinct was to refuse, to say no, to retreat into the silence that had defined her life. The ghosts whispered that it was safer that way. But Ochoa's eyes held the same fire Elena had once seen in her brother Miguel, that restless hunger to serve, to learn, to be worthy of the uniform. "What exactly would you want me to say?" Elena asked, her voice low. Whatever you can, Ochoa replied. Within classification, of course. But even hearing you speak about discipline, sacrifice, endurance, it would mean more than 1,000 pages of doctrine. Elena's throat tightened. She thought of Miguel again, standing tall in the desert night, his voice cutting through chaos. Don't stop. Don't ever stop. For the first time, she realized those words weren't just a command for survival. They were a command for legacy. Slowly, she nodded. All right, Lieutenant, I'll do it. Ochoa's face lit with something between relief and joy. Thank you, ma'am. I'll arrange it with command. My platoon will be honored. They exchanged contact information, Ochoa's hands trembling slightly as she handed over a notepad. Then the young lieutenant saluted again before departing, her stride brisk, her shoulders squared with renewed purpose. Elena stood at the counter a moment longer, the paper slip in her hand. The idea of standing before a platoon, of speaking openly, terrified her. Yet beneath the fear, something else stirred. Pride. For so long, she had lived with silence as her armor. Now, perhaps, her words could become her weapon. As she left the commissary, her groceries balanced in one hand, she noticed soldiers in uniform glance at her jacket, then straighten reflexively. Not out of mockery, but out of respect. The world hadn't changed overnight. But piece by piece, stitch by stitch, recognition was taking root. And Elena Vargas, who once believed her story would be buried forever in redacted files and forgotten graves, began to understand that perhaps her purpose wasn't to stay silent in shadows but to speak, so the next generation would know what sacrifice truly meant. The morning sun burned high over Fort Sheridan, casting sharp light across the parade ground. Elena had just finished her therapy session, sweat still dampening her gray hairline, when she heard her name. Captain Vargas. She turned, instinctively straightening. General Robert Kane was approaching, flanked not by aides this time, but by a single colonel trailing respectfully behind. His steps were deliberate, his expression unreadable. General, Elena said with a nod. Kane's eyes softened slightly. Just the person I wanted to see. They fell into step together, the colonel peeling away to give them privacy. I have news, Kane said, his tone low but heavy. The declassification process has moved forward faster than expected. Enough records have been released to validate service recognition. More importantly, we found something. Elena's pulse quickened. What? Kane stopped walking, turning to face her directly. Your brother, Sergeant Miguel Vargas. His service and death are no longer listed as a training accident. His voice dropped further, carrying a weight that seemed to press the air flat around them. His daughter will be presented with his Silver Star next month. Officially, publicly. Elena's knees threatened to buckle. She gripped the strap of her bag until her knuckles turned white. His Silver Star? Kane nodded firmly. It's been classified for 22 years, buried in reports I wasn't even supposed to access. But now, with Falcon Unit partially unsealed, we were able to confirm his actions. He held the perimeter long enough for the diplomatic team and the last chopper to lift out. Without him, none of us would have made it. He died a hero, and now his daughter will finally hear the truth. Elena's vision blurred. She fought to hold back the tide, but the tears came anyway, hot and unstoppable. She turned slightly, her hand covering her mouth as her chest heaved. For years, she had carried Miguel alone. For years, she had whispered his name into silence. And now, the world would finally know who he was. She's 26 now, Kane continued softly. She grew up believing her father tripped on a live wire during training. That's what the report told her. That's what the military let her believe. Now she'll know he died standing in the fire, buying time for others to live. Elena's tears turned to shaking sobs. She pressed her hand harder against her mouth, her shoulders trembling. Her voice cracked when she finally spoke. She'll finally know he wasn't just gone, that he mattered. Kane's gaze was steady, though his eyes carried the weight of shared grief. He mattered more than most of us combined. And now, the record will show it. For a moment, they simply stood there in the sunlight, the parade ground around them fading into silence. When Elena finally found her voice, it was steadier. Thank you, sir. I don't know how to face her, his daughter. What could I possibly say? Kane's tone softened. You'll know. She deserves to hear from the last person who saw him alive. and from the sister who carried his memory through fire and silence. Elena drew a shuddering breath, wiping her cheeks roughly with the back of her hand. She squared her shoulders, standing straighter despite the ache in her hip. If it helps her, I'll be there. Kane's mouth twitched into something close to a smile. Good, because I want you standing beside me at that ceremony. His bloodline deserves the medal, but his sister deserves to see it placed where it belongs. The weight of those words pressed into her chest, heavy but righteous. For 2 decades, she had lived in the shadows, bearing the guilt of survival. For 2 decades, she had been erased. But now, Miguel's name would rise from the ash heap of silence, carried not only by her, but by history. And for the first time in years, Elena Vargas felt the possibility of peace. The auditorium at Fort Sheridan was packed. Rows of uniforms filled the seats, ribbons gleaming under the stage lights. At the front, a wooden podium stood flanked by 2 flags, the Stars and Stripes and the Army Standard. The atmosphere buzzed with ceremony, but underneath ran a current of reverence, as though everyone sensed they were about to witness something extraordinary. Elena Vargas sat in the front row, her brother's jacket folded neatly across her lap. She wore her own uniform jacket, the Falcon insignia stitched firmly in place, the Presidential Unit citation glinting just below. For the first time, she wasn't here to fight for recognition, she was here to witness it. Beside her sat a young woman with Miguel's eyes. His daughter, Isabel Vargas, 26 years old, her dark hair tied back simply, her hands clenched in her lap. She wore a plain navy dress. No uniform, no ribbons. Only the weight of years spent believing her father had died in a meaningless accident. She glanced at Elena nervously. I still don't understand why I'm here, Isabel whispered. Elena's throat tightened. She reached out, placing a steadying hand over Isabel's. You will, she said softly. In a few minutes, you will. The murmurs died as General Kane stepped to the podium. He wore his dress uniform, stars gleaming like fire. His voice, when he spoke, carried to every corner of the room. Today we correct a silence that has lasted far too long. For more than 20 years, the name Sergeant Miguel Vargas has been buried under words that did not belong to him: training mishap, equipment failure, classified loss. Those words were lies. The truth is this: Sergeant Vargas died a hero, holding back overwhelming enemy forces to secure the evacuation of 32 American lives, including my own. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Isabel's eyes widened, her lips parting in shock. Kane's voice grew heavier. For his actions on that night, he was recommended for the Silver Star. Bureaucracy, secrecy, and cowardice buried it. But today, at last, we honor him properly. An aide stepped forward carrying a small velvet box. Kane opened it, and the metal gleamed beneath the lights, the Silver Star, brilliant and solemn. Would Isabel Vargas please join me on stage? Kane said. Isabel froze, her body rigid. Elena leaned closer, whispering, Go, Mija. This is for you. Shaking, Isabel stood and walked to the stage. Her steps were slow, her eyes glistening. She turned to face Kane, who bowed his head slightly before pinning the medal to her dress. The auditorium erupted in applause. Soldiers stood, clapping hard. Veterans saluted. Civilians wiped tears. But Elena didn't clap. She couldn't. Because the moment her niece's shoulders shook under the medal, Elena was no longer in the auditorium. She was back in the desert. The canyon walls roared with gunfire. Helicopters burned, their rotors twisted wreckage. Smoke stung her lungs. And Miguel, her brother, her blood stood at the ridge, his rifle spitting fire. Go! He shouted, his voice raw. Elena, get them out! She remembered the heat on her face, the metallic tang of blood on her tongue. She remembered dragging 2 wounded soldiers toward the chopper, screaming at Miguel to fall back. But he didn't. He stayed. She saw him silhouetted in the fire, his figure framed against the blaze like a statue carved in flame. His mouth moved. Don't stop. Don't ever stop. Then the ridge exploded. The chopper lifted, sand whipping into her eyes, and through the haze, she saw him fall. Back in the auditorium, Elena clutched her brother's jacket so tightly her knuckles burned. The sound of applause blurred into the phantom roar of engines and fire. Tears poured unchecked down her cheeks. On stage, Isabel wept openly, her hand pressed against the metal. Kane rested a hand on her shoulder, steadying her. His own eyes shone faintly, betraying the weight of what he had carried. When the applause finally quieted, Isabel's gaze sought Elena's. Confusion, grief, and pride swirled in her young eyes. "Is it true?" she mouthed silently. Elena rose to her feet. Slowly, deliberately, she walked to the stage. When she reached Isabel, she placed Miguel's jacket in her niece's arms. "Yes," Elena said, her voice breaking but strong. "It's true. He died saving us all. And now the world knows." Isabel clutched the jacket and metal together, tears soaking the fabric. For the first time in her life, she knew her father not as a rumor or a lie, but as a soldier, a brother, a hero. The auditorium stood once more, the ovation thundering like artillery fire. And Elena Vargas, who had carried Miguel's memory in silence for 22 years, finally felt the crushing weight lift, not gone, never gone, but shared by every soul in the room. The ghosts of Falcon Unit were no longer nameless shadows. They were honored. The ceremony ended, but the weight of it lingered like smoke in the air. Soldiers filed out in hushed silence, the kind reserved for funerals and sacred ground. Isabel Vargas clutched her father's jacket against her chest, her tear-streaked face glowing with pride and grief all at once. Elena stood beside her, steadying her with a hand on her shoulder. General Kane lingered at the edge of the stage, waiting. When the last of the audience dispersed, he approached. "You did well, Captain," he said quietly. Elena shook her head. "I did nothing. She deserved the truth. Miguel deserved this day." Kane's expression hardened. "You did more than you realize. Without your persistence, without your refusal to be erased, this day would never have come. And I'm not finished." Her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" He gestured for her to walk with him. They moved down a quiet hallway, the sound of Isabel's sobs still echoing faintly behind them. When they reached a side office, Kane closed the door and turned to face her. "I've been reviewing officer development protocols," he said. "The same arrogance that nearly broke you in that commissary, it's not isolated. Young officers come in thinking medals and posture make a soldier. They don't understand sacrifice. They don't understand the quiet cost of service. And that ignorance can kill men." Elena crossed her arms, watching him carefully. "I told Cross and Walker the same. Arrogance will cost lives. I've seen it." Kane nodded. "That's why I'm establishing a new program. Specialized training in leadership ethics and extraction operations. And I want you on the team that builds it." Her heart jolted. "Me?" "Yes, you," Kane said firmly. "No manual, no doctrine, no polished lecture can match lived experience. You carried Falcon Unit's lessons through fire and through silence. You know what it costs to endure when no one is watching, when no one will ever know the truth. That's what I want these young officers to hear." Elena hesitated, her throat tightening. The idea of standing before a room full of fresh-faced lieutenants, telling them pieces of a story she had spent decades locking away, made her chest constrict. "I'm not a teacher, sir," she said. "I was never meant to stand at a podium." Kane's eyes softened, but his voice was unyielding. "You weren't meant to carry ghosts alone either, but you did. And now you have a chance to turn that pain into guidance. To make sure no other soldier mocks what they don't understand. To make sure your brother's sacrifice, your sacrifice, doesn't fade into silence again." Her fingers brushed the falcon patch on her jacket. For years, it had been a private relic, a symbol of what she could never say. Now, it gleamed openly, a badge of survival, of truth reclaimed. "What would you want me to do?" she asked finally. "Speak," Kane said simply. "Tell them what you can. Show them what silence looks like. Show them what it costs to underestimate the quiet ones. Give them the Vargas protocol in flesh and blood." The words hit her harder than she expected. For years, she had believed her story was a burden, a curse to be carried alone. Now Kane was telling her it was a weapon not of destruction but of instruction. She swallowed hard, fighting the surge of fear that rose in her chest. "I'll think about it." "Don't think too long," Kane replied. "The Army doesn't need more arrogance. It needs truth. And truth has been waiting 22 years for your voice." With that, he left her in the quiet hallway, the weight of his words pressing against her chest. Elena leaned back against the wall, her mind swirling. She thought of Isabel clutching Miguel's jacket, of Cross saluting with humbled eyes, of Ochoa's eager request to share falcon lessons with her platoon. She thought of the ghosts that had haunted her for so long and wondered if perhaps they weren't ghosts at all, but teachers waiting to be heard. For the first time, the idea didn't terrify her. It tempted her. The classroom was filled with crisp uniforms, fresh bars gleaming under the fluorescent lights. A dozen young lieutenants sat ramrod straight at their desks, notebooks open, eyes flicking nervously toward the empty podium at the front. They had been told today's session would be different. They had no idea how. The door opened. Elena Vargas stepped inside. She wore her brother's jacket, the Falcon unit patch stitched clearly above her heart. The presidential unit citation pin glinted faintly beneath it. She carried no notes, no binder, no slides, only the weight of memory. A ripple moved through the room. Whispers. Recognition. The Vargas protocol was already legend here, a case study spoken in low voices. And now the woman at its center stood before them in flesh and blood. She walked slowly to the podium, her limp still present but tempered by strength rebuilt. When she reached the front, she let her eyes sweep the room. She saw youth, ambition, arrogance, not yet tested. She saw Miguel in every eager face. "Sit easy," she said, her voice steady, husky from years of disuse, but carrying like steel. The lieutenants relaxed slightly, though their eyes never left her. "My name is Captain Elena Vargas, Falcon Unit." She paused, letting the words hang. "Most of you have never heard of us. That's because we weren't meant to be remembered. We fought in shadows. We were written out of history. But the battlefield doesn't care about memory. It only cares what you do when it's your turn to stand." The room was silent. She continued. "Some of you will think rank makes you untouchable, that a shiny uniform means respect is owed to you. You'll look at the quiet ones, the limping ones, the scarred ones, and you'll assume you're stronger, smarter, better. I'm here to tell you that arrogance will kill your men faster than any bullet." One lieutenant shifted uncomfortably. Elena's eyes fixed on him, pinning him like a spotlight. "I was mocked in this very base, called a fraud, a beggar, a thief of valor, by men wearing the same bars you do now. They didn't know the ghosts I carried. They didn't know the lives I'd seen lost. They didn't know that the jacket they sneered at belonged to a man who held a canyon alone so they could live in ignorance. My brother, Sergeant Miguel Vargas. He died so 32 Americans could go home. For 22 years, the Army told his daughter he tripped in a training mishap. That's what arrogance costs. That's what silence costs." Her voice caught, but she pushed through it, her gaze fierce. "You have a choice, each of you, to carry your bars like shields for your ego, or to carry them like the weight of the lives under your command. Choose wrong, and you'll mock the wrong veteran, dismiss the wrong scar, underestimate the wrong soldier, and when the bullets come, you'll wish you had listened." Silence thundered in the room. The lieutenants sat frozen, their pens untouched, their eyes wide. Elena exhaled slowly. "Falcon Unit taught me one lesson above all else. We fight in shadows so others can live in light. If you remember nothing else, remember this: respect the shadows. Respect the ones who carry scars you cannot see, because one day, they might be the reason you make it home." She stepped back from the podium. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, one by one, the lieutenants rose to their feet. They came to attention, spines rigid, saluting in unison. Elena hesitated, then returned the salute, crisp and precise. The gesture cut through her like fire, but not the kind that burned, the kind that cleansed. When she left the room, the hallways of Fort Sheridan felt brighter. The air felt lighter. Outside, the Texas sun blazed across the parade ground. Soldiers jogged in formation, cadences ringing in the air. Elena paused, her groceries tucked under one arm, Miguel's jacket warm against her chest. For the first time in decades, she smiled a true smile, one that reached her eyes. She was no longer a ghost. She was a survivor, a sister, a soldier, a teacher. And though the shadows of Falcon Unit would always remain, she had finally stepped into the light.